What's up, story lovers? In today's chapter, we're going over point of view, so grab that pen, grab that coffee. We're diving in. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Right Now. I am so excited today because we get to go over one of the most important elements of storytelling, and that is point of view. So, point of view is basically the camera lens that a story is told through. So, what kind of point of view you're using is basically contingent upon how the camera is zoomed in or zoomed out, or how wide the camera is on the story itself. It's going to make a little bit more sense as I get into it more. So let's jump right in with first person point of view. First person is the I, me of the story. So that's where a speaker is telling their own story. So this is the story that happened to me. That would be first person point of view. So for example, it would be, I went to the store. I grabbed the book. I got attacked by a bunch of skeletons climbing out of the swampy grave. Now, there are a lot of pros and cons that come with telling a story in first-person point of view, and the first one that I can think of would be that you are more easily able to create an intimate connection between the reader and the character. You're able to seamlessly jump into the character's mind because you're already there. You're the character. That's the speaker. So the reader has constant access to the thoughts, emotions, feelings, dilemmas, troubles that come with that character. On the other hand, one of the cons of this would be that you have incredibly limited access to the outside information of the story's world. So anything that the character is not privy to, the reader's really not privy to either. So it forces the writer to be much more creative if you want to give the reader information that the character doesn't necessarily know directly. Whether that be through any kind of second-hand knowledge that comes across the character. Message comes across on a TV screen and they have to deduce what's happening in the world around them that they don't see. A good example of this is in The Hunger Games, where Katniss sees graffiti of a potential rebellion that she doesn't really know is happening, but is happening. In the movies, they're able to do this a lot more direct to the viewer because this is no longer in first person with the movie. It goes to a limited third person, but that is basically the gist of that. Another pro would be that you are able to more easily create a natural conversational tone of voice for the narrator. So if I'm telling you my story, it's so much easier to create a, hey, so I'm sitting at a bar and I'm telling you this is what happened to me, as opposed to telling someone else's story. That's going to be a lot harder to get that natural conversational voice across. A con to that, however, would be that the narration is really limited to the vocabulary, intellect, and voice of that one character. So for example, let's say that you have a central character that's a child and it's in first person point of view. Something I would not suggest for a beginning writer. It's going to be incredibly difficult to get across a lot of information that you might need in your story because you're in the mind and vocabulary set and intellect of a child. The dramatic tension might be hard to raise if you're speaking from the voice of a child. It might be hard to describe some things. It might be hard to do really a lot of things that you want to do in storytelling if you're speaking through a child, which is why a lot of the times with child characters, it's probably going to be easier to speak in third person, which we'll get to in a minute. Going back to one of the pros of telling a story in first person point of view is character building. So the character is more easily able to express to the reader their ideals, their views, their backstory, going into flashbacks seamlessly because we are constantly in their mindset. However, a consequence of this is that you have more limits to creating subplots. So plots of other characters are going to be a lot harder to build in. Plots that aren't directly linked to your main character are going to be very hard to weave in with this, which is why first-person point of view can be sometimes challenging for a beginning writer. The last consequence I want to talk about is the sentence structure of the story. You can oftentimes get stuck into the I of a story. I went to the market. I picked up my girlfriend. I did this. I saw that. So you're going to have to really get more creative and figure out how to start your sentences in ways that aren't going to be a constant drone to the ear of your reader. So to show you exactly what I mean by the potentially repetitive nature of using first person, I have here Anchi Min's Red Azalea, which, don't get me wrong, this is an amazing book. I think it's incredibly well written and well crafted. It's not fiction, it happens to be memoir. However, this page happens to be a good example of the repetitive sentence structure of, if you notice here, the constant I wrote to my parents in Shanghai, I told them about, I said we were very good. I mean, this can get incredibly repetitive. If you notice on the page, all of the this doesn't happen that often in this book, but when it does happen, it can be a bit too much. Next up, we have a second-person point of view, which is the you of the story. So this is the point of view that turns the reader into the central character, into the main active agent of the story. And this is the point of view that most closely resembles that of a video game, where you're controlling the character. So one of the pros of this is that it can be incredibly engaging for the reader. And the reason for this is because it sort of creates a shared intimacy between the reader and the story itself. This is basically because the reader cannot escape the point of view of the character. There's really no way out of that. If the story is constantly you, it's just a direct link into the mind of the character because the reader is that character. However, there are some pretty substantial cons to this point of view. One of which is that the reader might not relate to the character. If you're telling the character you are a 6'5" red-headed man trampling through the forest, it's going to be very easy for the reader to say, I'm not doing that. No, I'm not. That's not me. And so it can create a direct disconnect, which is kind of ironic since this is the most connected point of view. Another consequence is that telling a story in second person can get incredibly confusing and annoying, especially over a long period of time. So if you're a beginning writer, I really would not suggest telling a story in second person point of view. However, if you're determined to, or if you want to experiment with it, I would suggest starting with a very short story as opposed to trying to break out a novel in second person. Even seasoned writers have a very difficult time telling a long story in second point of view while keeping the reader interested. The next point of view I want to talk about is third person, and we're going to break this down into 3 sub-categories of third person point of view. So this point of view is the he, she, they of the story. So this is the speaker or narrator telling the story of someone else. So to show you an example of third person, we're going to take a look at Stephen King's Carrie. Now, in this book, I have a few pages marked, and so for example, here we have when Miss Desjardins led Carrie up to the office 15 minutes later. Now, the main character is, of course, Carrie. And so here we have an example of the narrator speaking, talking about someone else's story, being Carrie. Now, one of the benefits in here is that, for example, if we go back to the beginning, we have what is a bit of a news clipping. And so you can really do some cool stuff with third person, putting things like this that are a bit unconventional in contemporary literature. And so here we have like a report. And then we go on and we have actual narrative. And then as the story goes on, we have sort of this weave between the narrative and the reports that sort of keep the story interesting and compelling and different. So close third is going to be the most relatable to first-person point of view. The speaker is telling someone else's story, but it's as though the camera is right on that character's shoulder, seeing through their eyes and only privy to the information that that character has direct access to. Panning out the camera a little bit is going to be limited third, and this is where the camera is back a little bit. It's maybe not necessarily on their shoulder, but it's sort of right behind them, and it sees mostly what their character has access to. However, it can jump out of their mind. It can jump into the minds of maybe a select couple other characters and see what their thoughts and feelings and views are. So it gives the reader more access than close third, but not quite as much access as the next point of view, which is third person omniscient. Now, this is basically where the speaker is the all-seeing god of the story. This is where they have access to unlimited information from unlimited characters and resources. They're not bound by space or time. They can tell the reader anything at any time about anything. So what are some of the pros and cons of telling a story in third person, whether it be close, limited, or omniscient? Well, one of the pros is the ability to use multiple characters to tell a story. Because the speaker is able to jump into the minds of several characters, it's the easiest point of view for creating subplots and really raising the complexion of the story and really making things more intricate and interesting. Along that line, you can also turn several of these characters into their own central character. Keep in mind, every single central character you have in a story is going to need their central plot. So, for example, let's go to Stephen King's 1408. Yes, I know, Stephen King again. In 1408, spoiler alert, the main plot line is that the main character, blanking on his name for a moment, he wants to spend the night in the supposedly haunted room, write his review on it, and get out. And then, as the story goes on, finds out there really is something weird with this room, and so the main plot becomes, I need to survive this room. Now, one of the subplots of that story is him dealing with the loss of his daughter and the breakdown of his relationship with his wife, or possibly ex-wife. I can't remember if they were still married at that point. So let's say that this story had another central character. So let's say that the concierge that was constantly trying to get him not to take the room, let's say that he was also a central character, and that the story at times directly followed his mindset and his point of view. Well, he would need his own main plot that the story would also have to follow. So this is what is called dual point of view. Now, when considering which point of view to follow at any given time, I was just thinking about which character is affected most by that scene at that moment, by the end of the scene, and going with that character. That's going to be your main focus for that scene. I would also recommend being careful because it's easy to head hop, and that's one of the biggest cons of writing in third person. It's incredibly easy to jump in and out of several characters' minds within the same scene or paragraph or sentence even, and that's a big no-no when it comes to writing stories because it can be incredibly confusing for your reader. They don't know who they're supposed to be following at any given moment or whose mind they're supposed to be in, and that can be incredibly disorienting and disengaging for the story. However, another pro is going to be the unlimited use of language. So because you're not directly tied to one character in third person, you're going to be able to mimic several characters' language and tone and voice. So you're going to have your main voice, which is going to be the speaker's voice, which may or may not be directly linked to your main character. However, they're going to be able to pan that camera in close whenever they want and mirror the way they speak to whatever character's mind the speaker's tapping into, and then pan back out. Maybe jump over here and look at this other character over here and mimic their voice, and then pan out. And so this can be incredibly fun to do. It can help to zero in the reader on what they're supposed to be following at any given moment. And as long as the transition is clear and concise, you should be able to have a lot of fun with this. Continuing the pros, another one is that the action can be added more easily in third person. Think about how a character experiences the world. It's going to be less realistic for a character to describe in vivid detail all the things that are happening around them, especially things that they're not necessarily witnessing. So, they're battling an orc that's directly in front of them, and they get shot in the back by an arrow. They're not going to be able to describe that in any great detail other than, my shoulder. So when in third person, you can really jump into a lot of vivid detail, important story-related detail that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do in first person. Keep in mind, don't overdo it. Just because you can describe every little thing doesn't mean you necessarily should at every given possible moment. Let's jump back over to the cons. So one of the consequences of writing in third person is that you run the risk of all your characters sounding the same. Their thoughts might be portrayed the same way. Their dialogue might come across the same way. They might say the same phrases as other characters. And when you do this, it can be a big red flag for the reader. They can be saying like, this is unrealistic, I don't buy this, all these characters sound like the same character. And it can also get incredibly confusing, making it hard for the reader to remember who anybody is because they can't tell them apart. Another consequence is that you run the risk of having more points of view than the story really needs. Since you're able to jump into any character's mind and have several main points of view in the story, it's easy to jump into every little character's mind, creating substantial seeming characters out of inconsequential secondary characters. Oftentimes being characters that maybe you actually should cut from the story because they aren't contributing much. But because you're able to access their mind, you could possibly turn them into a lot more than they really are. So as a fun exercise, think about the secondary characters in your story. Think about the characters that add the least, the ones that maybe you might want to cut from the story. Now, what story do they have to tell? What can you craft out of their lives for a separate story? This can be a very fun way to create several pieces out of one work of fiction. But jumping back into the consequence of risking having more points of view than necessary for third person, I would suggest having no more than 2 points of view if you're a beginning writer. Lastly, to round this all out, one of the biggest consequences is that you risk your characters knowing things that they should not know. Because let's say you have 3, 4, 5 characters that you're jumping in and out of the minds of, it's going to be harder to keep track of who knows what at what time. This person knows this information, this person doesn't know it, but later on does know it, and then this person later on forgets something. So you're going to have a system for keeping track of what characters know what and when they know it. So that wraps everything up for this video. I hope you learned a thing or two. Drop a comment down below with what point of view you prefer writing in. Perhaps it's close third, perhaps it's first person, perhaps you're making that challenging experimental dip into second person point of view. Till next time, bye.